The Whitmore Gallery glittered with the particular, dangerous elegance of a room full of people who all wanted each other dead and had agreed, for one evening, to pretend otherwise. Damian Cross stood near the center of it, a glass of untouched champagne in one hand, surrounded by men who smiled at him with the practiced warmth of people calculating exactly how much his death would be worth to them. He had come to this party knowing at least 3 families in that room considered him an obstacle worth removing. He had not come expecting the fourth threat to announce itself through a small, precise red dot he felt before he saw it, a faint, warm pressure against his temple that every year of his dangerous life had trained him to recognize instantly for exactly what it was. He did not move. Moving, in the half-second it took a sniper to correct aim, was often the difference between a graze and a grave. He was still calculating his next breath when a woman he recognized instantly, a woman whose face had haunted the edges of 3 separate assassination attempts against his own family over the last 2 years, crossed the room toward him with the easy, unhurried grace of someone who belonged there completely. Elena Vasquez. The only child of Salvatore Vasquez, the man who had spent a decade trying to bury the cross name in the ground his own father had built it on. The last woman on earth Damian expected to see walking directly toward him in a room full of witnesses. She reached him in 4 steps, close enough that anyone watching would have read the movement as intimate, and slid her hand along his jaw with a familiarity that made every instinct in his body scream contradiction. Because Elena Vasquez did not touch him. Elena Vasquez had once put a knife an inch from his ribs at a shipping negotiation and told him, calmly, that the next one wouldn't miss. "Pretend I'm your wife," she whispered against his ear, her voice pitched low enough that only he could hear it, her lips barely moving. "There's a red dot on your forehead." Damian's entire body went still in a different way now, not the frozen stillness of a man calculating his odds against a sniper, but the sharp, disoriented stillness of a man whose enemy had just spoken words that made no sense coming from her mouth at all. "You're going to kill me yourself," he said quietly, his own lips barely moving. "And you want me to stand still for it?" "If I wanted you dead," Elena said, sliding her arms around his neck with a practiced ease that made the nearby cluster of guests turn. "Murmur, watch. I'd have let that dot finish its job 3 seconds ago instead of walking across this entire room to stop it." Damian felt the second confirmation land harder than the first. The dot was real. She had seen it before he had, and she was standing directly in its likely path now. Her own body between the window it was tracking from and the man she had every reason in the world to want dead. "Kiss me," Elena said, low, urgent, her eyes flicking once toward the tall bank of windows along the gallery's east wall. "Now, Damian. It buys us the 2 seconds we need to move without it looking deliberate." "You're asking me to trust you," Damian said. "I'm telling you," Elena said, "that you have 4 seconds before that shooter adjusts for the fact that you haven't dropped yet. And I would rather you live long enough to hate me for this later than die tonight not knowing why I bothered." Damian Cross had not trusted anyone outside his own bloodline in 11 years. He had built an empire on precisely that principle. That trust was a door left open for exactly the kind of knife Elena Vasquez had once held to his ribs. And yet, watching her eyes now, sharp and steady and entirely unlike the calculating coldness he remembered from that shipping negotiation 2 years earlier, some instinct older than strategy told him that whatever this was, it was not the opening move of an assassination. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was fast, decisive, the kind of motion 2 people might use to disguise an entirely different kind of movement. And under the cover of it, Elena's hand closed hard around his wrist and pulled, angling both their bodies half a step sideways, out of the direct line the dot had been tracking, toward the marble pillar 3 feet to their left. The gunshot came a half-second later, muffled by distance and a suppressor, the bullet burying itself in the exact spot where Damian's chest had been standing a moment before, punching a small, precise hole through the gallery's east window that most of the room mistook, in the chaos of the following seconds, for a champagne glass shattering somewhere near the bar. Elena had already pulled him fully behind the pillar, her back pressed against the marble, her breathing controlled despite the adrenaline Damian could feel humming through the hand still gripping his wrist. "Now," she said quietly, not releasing him, her eyes scanning the room with a sharp, practiced awareness that told him this was not the first time she had done exactly this. "You're going to smile at whoever's watching. Put your arm around your loving wife and walk me toward that side exit like nothing happened at all. Because if this room realizes what almost happened, Damian, we are both dead before we reach the door." Damian looked at her, the woman who had spent 2 years trying to destroy everything he'd built, standing close enough now that he could feel her heartbeat still racing beneath the calm mask of her expression, and understood, with a cold, disorienting clarity, that whatever game Elena Vasquez was playing tonight, it had just cost her the element of surprise on both sides of a war she'd apparently decided, for reasons he could not yet begin to guess, was no longer worth winning at his expense. "Who are you protecting me from?" he said quietly. "And why does it matter to you if I live?" Elena's expression flickered, something old and complicated moving behind her careful composure, before she smoothed it away and reached up to straighten his tie with the easy, practiced motion of a woman who had done this 100 times in a marriage that had never actually existed. "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight, you smile, and you trust me exactly as far as it takes to get us both out of this room alive. That's all I'm asking for." They made it to the side exit in under 90 seconds. Damian's arms settled around Elena's waist with a practiced ease that surprised him. Some old, buried instinct for exactly this kind of performance, cultivated across years of galas and negotiations where a wrong expression could cost a man his life. The alley behind the gallery was narrow, cold, lit only by a single security light buzzing against the brick. The moment the door swung shut behind them, Elena stepped back from him fast, putting distance between their bodies with the same decisive speed she'd used to close it 30 seconds earlier. "Talk," Damian said, his voice dropping the careful warmth of the performance entirely, replaced now by something harder, more dangerous. "Right now, Elena. Who put that shooter in position? And why did you just burn 2 years of careful positioning to stop him from finishing the job?" "I don't know who hired the shooter," Elena said, checking the alley's far end with quick, professional glances that told Damian again. This was not new territory for her. "I only know he wasn't one of mine." "Convenient. We'll leave whatever you want," Elena said, something sharp entering her voice now. "I didn't have to walk across that entire room, Damian. I could have let it happen and watched from the bar with an alibi nobody would have questioned. Instead, I'm standing in an alley with a man who spent 2 years trying to find a reason to have my father killed, explaining myself to someone who clearly still thinks I'm the enemy." "You are the enemy," Damian said. "That hasn't changed because you decided for one night to stop a bullet meant for me." Something flickered across Elena's face, hurt, quickly buried, replaced by the same careful control she'd worn since the moment she'd crossed the gallery floor. "Fine," she said. "Believe that. It doesn't change the fact that whoever hired that shooter wanted you dead badly enough to risk it in a room full of witnesses from 5 different families, which means this wasn't business, Damian. This was personal, and it wasn't my family." Damian studied her, weighing the words against every instinct that told him trusting Elena Vasquez was the single most reckless decision he could make tonight. "Then whose?" "I don't know yet," Elena admitted. "But I intend to find out. Because if someone's willing to take a shot at you in the middle of a Whitmore gala, Damian, the next attempt won't be this careless, and it won't miss." A car's headlights swept the mouth of the alley, slowing, and both of them went instinctively still. Damian's hand moving toward the weapon holstered beneath his jacket before Elena's hand closed over his wrist, stopping him. "That's mine," she said quietly. "My driver. He'll take us somewhere safer than standing in an alley arguing about whether you trust me." "Us," Damian repeated. "You expect me to get in a car with you?" "I expect you," Elena said, "to understand that whoever just tried to kill you inside that gallery is going to assume, within the hour, that your new wife was somehow involved in stopping it. Which means, Damian, that I am now exactly as much a target as you are. And neither of us survives the next 24 hours by walking away from each other pretending tonight didn't happen." Damian looked at the approaching car, then back at Elena, something cold and calculating moving behind his eyes as he ran the math she'd just laid out. Because she was right, and he hated that she was right, and hated more that some part of him had already decided, in the space of one gunshot and one kiss that shouldn't have felt like anything at all, that he wanted to know exactly what this woman was risking her own life to protect him from. "One car ride," he said. "And then you're going to start explaining exactly why the daughter of Salvatore Vasquez just saved the life of the man her father has spent a decade trying to destroy." Elena's jaw tightened, something old and complicated moving behind her careful composure again. "My father," she said quietly, "doesn't know I'm here tonight. He doesn't know about the party. And he certainly doesn't know I just stopped a bullet meant for you." She held Damian's gaze steadily as the car pulled up beside them. There's a great deal about my family you don't understand, Damian. Tonight was supposed to be about keeping you alive long enough for me to explain it on my own terms. Instead, I've got maybe an hour before whoever hired that shooter realizes I interfered, and considerably less time than that before my father realizes I was even in the building. The car door opened, and Damian, against every survival instinct he'd spent 11 years honing, climbed in beside the one woman in New York he had genuine reason to believe might still, somewhere underneath tonight's rescue, want him dead more than anyone else in that gallery ever had. "Start talking," he said, once the door closed and the car pulled away from the curb. "And Elena, if I find out this was staged, if I find out you and that shooter are working together to earn my trust before finishing what he started, there won't be a version of tonight that ends with you walking away." Elena looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable and exhausted moving behind her careful, guarded eyes. "2 years ago," she said quietly, "at that shipping negotiation, when I put a knife to your ribs and told you the next one wouldn't miss. Do you remember what I said right before that, Damian? What I asked you before my father's men walked in, and I had 30 seconds to make you believe I was exactly the threat everyone already assumed I was." Damian frowned, the memory surfacing slowly, details he hadn't examined closely in 2 years suddenly sharpening under her question. "You asked if I knew what happened to my mother's shipping contact in Marseille, the one who disappeared 6 months before that. And you told me," Elena said, "that it wasn't relevant to the negotiation, and I let it go. Because my father's men were 30 seconds from that door, and I couldn't afford to explain what I actually meant." Her voice had gone quiet, careful, the first genuine crack Damian had seen in her composure all night. "It's relevant now, Damian. More relevant than you understand. And it's the entire reason I was in that gallery tonight, watching for exactly the kind of threat that almost killed you 20 minutes ago." The car wound through empty midnight streets toward a location Elena refused to name until they were nearly there, and Damian sat in tense silence beside her, turning her words over with the same careful precision he brought to every negotiation that mattered. "My mother's contact in Marseille," he said finally. "Alessandro Ferro. He handled our European shipping routes for 6 years before he disappeared. My father always assumed it was a rival family sending a message." "It wasn't a rival family," Elena said quietly, watching the city slide past the window. "Alessandro Ferro was my mother's brother, Damian. My uncle." Damian went very still. "Your mother, Isabel Ferro," Elena said, "before she married my father and became Isabel Vasquez. She died when I was 6. Officially, it was a car accident on a wet road outside Boston." Something hardened in her voice. "Unofficially, I spent the last 15 years learning that almost nothing about my mother's death, or my uncle's disappearance 6 months before it, was what my father told me it was." "What are you saying, Elena?" "I'm saying," Elena said, turning to face him fully now, the careful mask finally slipping to reveal something raw underneath it, "that my father didn't just build his empire fighting your family for territory, Damian. He built part of it by erasing my mother's side of it entirely, her brother, her business connections, eventually her. Once she started asking too many questions about where her own brother had actually gone." The car pulled to a stop outside a modest brownstone in a quiet, unremarkable neighborhood. Nothing like the estates either of their families typically occupied, and Elena led him inside without further explanation. Through a narrow hallway into a small study lined with boxes and folders that looked, Damian realized slowly, like the accumulated evidence of years spent building a case in secret. "This is everything I found in the last decade," Elena said, gesturing at the room. "Bank records. Shipping manifests. A witness statement from a dock worker who saw my uncle get into a car with 2 of my father's men the night before he disappeared, and never saw him again." She turned to face Damian directly. "My father didn't just fight your family for territory, Damian. He used the war between your families as cover to consolidate everything my mother's side of the business controlled. And he erased anyone who might have eventually pieced together what actually happened to Alessandro Ferro." Damian moved slowly through the room, scanning the documents with the same sharp, methodical attention he brought to his own ledgers. Understanding arriving in pieces that reshaped, painfully, an entire decade of assumptions he'd built his family's strategy around. "You've spent your whole life," he said slowly, "gathering evidence against your own father." "I've spent my whole life," Elena said, "trying to understand why my mother died asking questions nobody wanted answered, and why I grew up being trained to hate a family that, as far as I can actually prove, never touch my uncle at all. She crossed her arms, something fierce and exhausted in her posture. Everyone assumes the Vasquez Cross war is about territory. It's not, Damian. Or at least, it didn't start that way. My father needed a convenient enemy to blame for his own crimes, and your family was already positioned perfectly to take the fall. Damian looked up from the documents, something cold moving through his chest that had nothing to do with tonight's assassination attempt. Then who tried to kill me tonight, if not your father's people? That, Elena said, is the part one haven't figured out yet, which terrifies me considerably more than anything your family has ever done to mine. She sat down heavily in the chair beside the desk. Someone wanted you dead tonight badly enough to risk it in a room full of witnesses, Damian, and it wasn't my father. Because my father still believes killing you outright would start a war he's not prepared to win. Whoever hired that shooter wants something faster and messier than my father's patient, decades-long strategy. You've been watching me, Damian said slowly, the pieces continuing to shift into place. Not as an enemy gathering intelligence, as someone protecting me. For 8 months, Elena admitted. Since I found evidence that someone inside your own organization has been quietly meeting with a party neither your family nor mine has been able to identify. I didn't come to that gallery tonight to attend a party, Damian. I came because my sources told me something was going to happen there, and I couldn't get a warning to you through any channel that wouldn't immediately expose exactly what I've spent the last decade building against my own father. Damian sat down slowly across from her, the weight of the evening finally settling into something he could actually process. You risked your father discovering everything you've built tonight, in front of witnesses from 5 families, to save the life of a man whose family your father spent 15 years teaching you to hate. Yes, Elena said simply. Why? Damian said. Not the mission, Elena. Not the strategy. Why you, specifically, walking across that room instead of sending a warning through someone safer? Elena held his gaze for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving behind her tired eyes. Because, she said quietly, somewhere in 8 months of watching you from a distance. Gathering intelligence, I told myself, was purely strategic. I stopped being able to convince myself that letting you die tonight would actually serve anything I've spent my whole life trying to accomplish. Before Damian could respond, the study's single window shattered inward, and both of them dropped instinctively to the floor as a second shot buried itself in the wall exactly where Damian's head had been a half-second earlier. Down, Elena hissed, though Damian was already moving, both of them flattening against the floor as a third shot punched through the window frame, spraying wood splinters across the study rug. They followed us, Damian said, his weapon already drawn, crawling toward the wall beside the window where he'd be out of the shooter's line of sight. Or they knew this location before we ever arrived. Nobody knows about this house, Elena said, her own weapon appearing from somewhere beneath her jacket with a speed that told Damian, once again. This was a woman who had spent considerably more of her life prepared for exactly this kind of violence than her elegant gallery appearance had suggested. Nobody, Damian. Not my father, not my own people. I bought this property under a name that doesn't exist on any record connected to the Vasquez family. Then how? The answer arrived before either of them could finish the thought, in the form of a fourth shot that struck the door frame instead of the window, forcing them both to understand. In the same cold instant that the shooter had moved position, not firing from the street outside, but from somewhere inside the house itself. They're inside, Elena breathed. Damian moved fast, positioning himself between Elena and the study door, weapon raised. Listening past the ringing in his ears for the particular, careful footsteps of someone who knew exactly how to move through an unfamiliar space without announcing themselves. There's a second exit, Elena whispered, already moving low toward a bookshelf along the far wall. Through the kitchen. My uncle built this house himself. Before he disappeared, there's a passage behind here that leads to the basement, and from there, a tunnel to the garage 2 houses down. You have an escape tunnel in a house nobody knows exists. I told you, Elena said, pulling the bookshelf open with a soft, well-oiled click. I've spent my whole life preparing for exactly this kind of night. They moved through the narrow passage fast. Damian closed behind her, both of them listening for pursuit through the darkness. The tunnel was cramped, cool, smelling of old stone and disuse, and it took nearly 90 seconds of careful, silent movement before they emerged into a small, unremarkable garage 2 houses down, exactly as Elena had promised. Whoever's in that house right now, Damian said, catching his breath against the garage wall. either had inside knowledge of this property, or they've been tracking one of us with considerably more precision than a lucky guess at a gala would explain. I know, Elena said, her voice tight with something that sounded, for the first time all night, genuinely frightened rather than simply controlled. Which means either my father's operation is more compromised than I realized, or someone inside my own organization, Damian said slowly, has been feeding information to whoever wants me dead badly enough to follow us through 2 locations in one night. Elena looked at him, the same cold, careful calculation he'd seen her use all evening now turning toward a problem neither of them had fully anticipated. You said months ago that you suspected someone inside your organization was leaking information. That's what I've been tracking for 8 months, Damian. Not just an outside threat. A source close enough to you to know your movements before you make them. You think tonight's shooter and your 8-month investigation are connected. I think, Elena said, that whoever hired that shooter at the gallery knew exactly where I'd take you afterward. Which means they either followed us with considerably more skill than either of us noticed, or someone already knew about this property before tonight, someone I trusted enough to tell. The implication settled between them heavily, and Damian watched something shift in Elena's expression, not fear now, but a colder, more focused fury. The particular anger of someone realizing a betrayal considerably closer to home than she'd been prepared to consider. There's only one person alive who knows about this house besides me, she said slowly. My father's former lieutenant, Marco Delgado. He helped me build this place 4 years ago, when I first started gathering evidence against my father. I trusted him completely. Trusted, Damian repeated. Past tense. Past tense, Elena confirmed, her jaw tight. Because the only way tonight makes sense, Damian, is if Marco Delgado has spent the last 4 years pretending to help me build a case against my father, while actually reporting everything I've found straight back to him. Damian's mind moved fast through the implications, the entire structure of tonight's danger reshaping itself again around this new, colder possibility. If your father's known about your investigation this whole time, then he's known I've been protecting you, Elena said quietly, which means tonight's assassination attempt might not have come from an unknown enemy at all. She looked at Damian, something devastated moving behind her careful composure. It might have come from my own father, using tonight as an opportunity to kill 2 problems at once. The enemy he spent 15 years fighting, and the daughter who spent a decade building a case that would destroy him. They spent the next 2 hours in a rented room above a laundromat in Queens, a location Damian's own people had secured within 20 minutes of his emergency call, far enough from anywhere either family would think to search. Quiet enough for both of them to finally sit still and think. If Marco's been reporting to your father, Damian said, pacing the small room while Elena sat at a scarred wooden table, staring at nothing, then Salvatore has known about your investigation for years. Which means he's had years to decide how to handle a daughter who's building a case against him. And he chose tonight, Elena said quietly. Not to confront me directly. To have me killed alongside you at a party in a way that would look like collateral damage in the endless Cross Vasquez war rather than what it actually was. A father erasing a daughter who'd become inconvenient. Damian stopped pacing, watching her carefully. You don't sound surprised. I'm not, Elena admitted. Not really. I think some part of me has known for years exactly what my father was capable of. Ever since I found the first piece of evidence about my uncle. I just never let myself finish the thought all the way through to what it meant for me specifically. She looked up at him, something raw and exhausted in her expression. I spent my whole life terrified of becoming another Isabel Farrow. Tonight I think I finally understood that I already had. Damian crossed the room and sat down across from her, something in his own carefully guarded composure softening in a way he didn't fully examine. Why me, Elena? Of everyone you could have turned to with 8 months of evidence against your own father, why protect the one man your father has spent 15 years teaching an entire organization to see as the enemy? Elena was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally answered, her voice carried none of the strategic calculations she'd used all night. Because you're the only person whose death would actually stop him, she said. If you die, Damian, my father wins the war he spent 15 years fighting, consolidates everything, and buries what happened to my uncle so completely that nobody will ever ask the question again. I couldn't let that happen. Not because I owe you anything. She held his gaze steadily. Because somewhere in 8 months of watching you build something legitimate out of what your own father left you, I started believing that the world genuinely needed you to survive this more than it needed me to stay safely uninvolved. Something shifted in the room, quiet and unspoken. The careful enemy distance both of them had maintained, even through the last several hours of danger finally, visibly cracking under the weight of everything Elena had just admitted. "There's something else," Elena said, before Damian could respond, reaching into her jacket and withdrawing a single folded photograph, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. "I found this 8 months ago, in records my father thought he'd destroyed completely. I haven't shown it to anyone. I wasn't sure I ever would." She slid it across the table. Damian unfolded it slowly and felt the entire foundation of the night shift again, harder this time, disorienting in a way even the assassination attempts hadn't managed. The photograph showed two men standing together outside a shipping office, laughing at something outside the frame, both of them young, easily recognizable despite the decades separating the image from the present. His own father, and Salvatore Vasquez, not as enemies, as partners, unmistakably. The easy familiarity between them, the kind that only existed between men who trusted each other completely. "That photograph is 31 years old," Elena said quietly. "Taken 4 years before either of us was born, Damian. Before the war between our families supposedly started." She watched his face carefully as the implications settled. "I think everything we've both been told about why our families became enemies is a lie. I think something happened between our fathers that neither of them ever wanted either of us to understand. And I think whatever it was, it's the real reason my uncle disappeared, the real reason my mother died asking questions, and the real reason someone wants both of us dead tonight before we can piece together what actually happened." Damian stared at the photograph, at his own father's face, younger and unguarded in a way he'd never once seen it in life, standing beside the man who had spent 15 years trying to destroy everything Damian had built, and understood, with a cold, disorienting clarity, that the entire war defining both their lives might have been built on a foundation neither of them had ever been permitted to see clearly. "We need to find out what actually happened," he said slowly, "before either of our fathers decides we've gotten close enough to the truth to be worth killing outright." They found the answer 3 days later, buried in a safety deposit box registered to Alessandro Ferro that had sat untouched for 22 years. A box Elena had known existed, but had never been able to access until Damian's own legal team found the loophole her father's lawyers had spent 2 decades making sure stayed buried. Inside was a single letter, written in Alessandro's own hand, dated 6 months before he disappeared. It explained everything. Damian's father and Salvatore Vasquez had not started as rivals. They had started as partners, building the earliest version of both their empires together. Until Salvatore discovered that Damian's father intended to legitimize the business entirely within a decade, real estate, shipping, above-board investments. The same transformation Damian himself had spent years quietly building toward without ever knowing his own father had once wanted the exact same thing. Salvatore had refused. The war that followed, the one both families had spent decades believing was about territory and betrayal, had actually begun because Damian's father chose honesty over empire, and Salvatore chose empire over everything else, including, eventually, his own brother-in-law, who had sided with Damian's father and paid for it with his life. "Your father tried to warn my mother," Elena said quietly, reading the letter a third time in the quiet of Damian's own study. 3 days and one dismantled empire later, Alessandro wrote that he was going to tell Isabel everything, that she deserved to know what her husband had actually done. He never got the chance. Salvatore Vasquez had been arrested 2 days earlier. The case built not on old grudges, but on 22 years of quiet, patient evidence his own daughter had assembled. Evidence that, combined with Damian's resources and legal reach, had finally proven both Alessandro Ferro's murder and Isabel Vasquez's death had been orchestrated, not accidental, by the very man who had spent 15 years teaching an entire organization and one grieving daughter to hate a family that had once tried to save hers. Marco Delgado had been dealt with quietly, the details of which Elena chose not to ask about and Damian chose not to volunteer. "I keep thinking," Elena said, setting the letter down finally, "about that first negotiation. 2 years ago. I put a knife to your ribs because my father told me you were the reason my life had been built on constant danger and suspicion. I believed him completely." She looked up at Damian, something soft and unguarded in her expression that hadn't existed in either of their lives before this week. I spent 2 years hating a man who turned out to be the only person whose father had actually tried to protect mine. I spent 2 years, Damian said, believing the woman who once held a knife to my ribs was exactly as dangerous as everyone told me she was. He crossed the room slowly, sitting beside her. I wasn't wrong, exactly. You are dangerous, Elena. You just spent that danger protecting me instead of destroying me. And I don't think I've fully caught up to what that means yet. What does it mean? Elena asked quietly. Now that neither of us has to pretend to be enemies anymore. Damien considered the question seriously, the way he considered every decision that mattered. It means, he said finally, that I'd like to find out what it looks like when Elena Vasquez isn't performing a role at all. Not the enemy's daughter, not the fake wife at a gala, not the woman building a decade-long case in secret. Just Elena, deciding what she actually wants, for the first time in longer than either of us have probably let ourselves imagine. Elena studied him for a long moment. Something warm and unguarded finally, fully replacing the careful calculation she'd carried through every scene of the last week. I think, she said slowly, I'd like to find that out too. 6 months later, at a considerably smaller and considerably less dangerous gathering than the Whitmore Gala that had started everything, Damien watched Elena across a quiet room, no red dots, no hidden agendas, no fathers left to manipulate either of them into a war neither had chosen, and found himself thinking, not for the first time, that the most reckless decision of his entire life had also, somehow, turned out to be the only one he'd never once regretted. You're staring, Elena said, crossing to stand beside him, sliding her hand into his with an ease that no longer required any performance at all. I'm remembering, Damien said. The last time you crossed a room to reach me like this. You told me to pretend you were my wife. And now, Damien said, I'd like to stop pretending. Some enmities are built on lies patient enough to survive decades. The truth, when it finally arrives, doesn't just end a war, sometimes. It reveals that the two people fighting hardest against each other were never really enemies at all. Only two children carrying a burden neither of them was ever meant to inherit. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe for more emotional Mafia romance stories, and share it with someone who believes the truth is always worth the danger of finding it. Did you suspect Elena's true motive before the photograph revealed the truth?